Dialog, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialog Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell. And for KLRB-FM, I'm Phil Kogan asking the questions. Mae, it seems almost ludicrous to even ask what we're going to talk about this week, so I won't ask. We'll just get right into it. But you might say what this show has done over the past year plus.
I'm laughing when you say Dialog Conspiracy. For the people who have listened before, it's always been Dialog Assassination, and there's been some suggestion of changing the title of the show to Dialog Conspiracy, along with the conjunction of the Conspiracy newsletter that's going to be published, coming out soon. Paul Krasner, the realist, is going to publish the newsletter. We've told you about it on other programs. I brought the address this week. We'll give it to you later to subscribe. Dialog Conspiracy. We'll talk about Wallace. We didn't even really touch on the death of Edgar Hoover, and we're right into the Wallace death, and we'll tie those together and put them into context. I brought in a copy of Paul Krasner's new book on, it's called How a Satirical Editor Becomes a Yippie Conspirator.
Can I interrupt in a minute? For the people who don't know what Dialog Assassination and Dialog Conspiracy is, let's fill them in on that.
You fill them in.
You fill them in.
Well,
my contract says I don't have to do that every week.
Okay. When we started this show a year ago, I came on the air as an interview for my opinion of the breaking of the Pentagon Papers in June last year. And I said that the nation had really one big story to cover in breaking, that was the political assassinations in the United States, and that nothing was as important as what happened in the past in order to understand what was going to be taking place in the future in our country, namely the fall, the summer of 72. Because my study of political assassinations is the study of how power moves, and we'll go into that. And when you kill political leaders, and particularly in these election years or close to their primary victories, like took place this week where they attempted to kill Wallace, that is the moving of power like a chessboard. We are moved, whether you know it or not, by a large number of people. They're small in number, but they're large in power. And they decide what is good for us, or who should rule us, or who should have the candidacy, who lives and who dies. And this is a conspiracy. The assassination is the way the conspiracy takes place. You have to kill certain people in order to maintain the power or keep the power rolling along. So we called it Dialog Assassination. The show has to do with the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and then a few hundred people that are important in the taking of power in the United States. But the conspiracy is part of it, the planning of the murders. Some people conspire and others are hired to do the shooting. I brought in this book of Paul's. It's a new book that just came out that you people should really have. It's a collection of essays and articles from the realist that he publishes, and they're articles from the last 10 years. But in the front page, he wrote a note for Mae, who helped bring about my religious conversion from coincidence to conspiracy. And I think that's good because today and all this week, people were seeing a lot of coincidences in the killing or the attempted killing of Wallace. And I see a conspiracy. And it gives me a good chance on this program for people who've heard the program before or picked it up along the way, followed it regularly, or new listeners. It gives me a chance to test my theories of conspiracy in the United States because Wallace lived, and the evidence is in front of you. When we talk about the murder of John Kennedy, many people listening to the show were too young to even realize what was happening or weren't catching on that this was going to become a pattern. And then the death of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy followed a few years later. But this is this week now, so we'll go into my theories of why it's a conspiracy, and you can take it from there and read the news as it comes along and test my opinion. And if Wallace lives, we'll have a better chance to test it because he has the guts that Robert Kennedy didn't have. See, Robert Kennedy wouldn't stand up to Lyndon Johnson and say it was a conspiracy. But if Wallace has any inkling that Richard Nixon did this to him, he'll stand up. And he has the nerve to do it. And we're going to go right into that because for several reasons. Now, 2 weeks ago, Phil, we had a show. It was on the 6th of May. And I referred to a party down in Texas. And it was simply a party at the time. It was a barbecue. And John Connally was having a party for the President of the United States and for Lyndon Johnson and some very wealthy people. I never did read the guest list. They were referred to as oil people, very wealthy people in the state of Texas. We know that Howard Hughes, who is the wealthiest man in the world right now, owns one state, Las Vegas. He owns Nevada, the whole state, the economy. But we're talking about Texas now. And I referred on that program to it being a war council, more than a barbecue, that power would move. And I read several quotations of another party down there at the home of Clint Murchison, November the 21st, 1963, that Edgar Hoover attended and Richard Nixon attended, at which time the A-OK to kill John Kennedy the next morning, the final plans, go or stop, were given in that garden. These are what I call war councils, written by Penn Jones, similar to the Normandy invasion plans. So two weeks ago they had a barbecue. And the news media that writes up that little affair and Life magazine don't refer to it in the same terms that I do. But what's happened in the 2 weeks since we were on the air? 2 days later, J. Edgar Hoover died. The second top man under him, Mr. Tolson, resigned from the FBI along with some other top people. Mr. Gray, Patrick Gray III, Nixon's man who sat with the National Security Council, the Defense Department, became head of the FBI. This is the man we did on a show last week, who put down the investigation of the murder of a important man in Los Angeles, Ruben Salazar, who was investigating the conspiracy of the federal government and the FBI and the Los Angeles Police Department as being a police state. Another black veteran in L.A. was killed, Jerry Lee May. Patrick Gray stopped that investigation. He stopped the investigation of the Special Enforcement Bureau of the Sheriff's Department and the Isla Vista investigation, which, if you went into that further, would have to do with the Sharon Tate La Bianca massacre. Patrick Gray worked on the anti-busing rule for Richard Nixon in the states pertaining to Georgia and Mississippi. Now, this is very important because we're going into the Wallace shooting, and Wallace was a thorn in Nixon's side because when Wallace came out against busing, then 2 days later Nixon takes the television and says, I'm against busing, breaking all the Supreme Court decisions. There was a competition between Richard Nixon and Wallace, like there was a competition between Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy. And these men played for real. They're not, when I talk about power, anything goes to keep the power. You don't just kill a lot of people in jungles of Vietnam with the electronic equipment, the type of warfare we have. The kind of mechanical death that is done, and I want to do one show on mechanical death and who does these things. 1 or 2 lives of another person in power don't mean a thing to these men. Now, this same week, Lyndon Johnson went back into the hospital, in quotes, hospital. He was safely tucked away. After the War Council, George Wallace was almost killed. We can refer to him as an assassination. He's living, but think in terms of what the intent was. Not that he had the fluke that he survived, and he still has very serious surgery with that particular bullet lodged in an important part of the spine. And his temperature is elevating now, and his pulse. So for all practical purposes, it wasn't meant that he lived. And then John Connally resigned from the Secretary of Treasury. Now, that's in just 2 weeks since we spoke about the War Council. And that is American history moving before your eyes. There are articles on the secrecy of John Connally stepping down. What was the mystery? Why is he doing it? Where is he going from here? There's an article in yesterday's paper, is he going to become a Republican? I said a year ago on the first show, and I've said on many shows, and because of the basis of my research, the two-party system died in Dallas. It died in 1960 in Los Angeles at the time of the election. It was decided that the victor would be the victim, and Republican and Democrat were in on that killing and all the other killings. And the facade that we have a two-party system, or that John Connally has to go home and register Republican, is just playing with your brains. If they want to play those games, let them play them. But I wish that the listening audience would understand that they are just games, and it doesn't matter how he registers. You know, see, I said the Civil War was won in Dallas, too. When Kennedy was killed, the power shifted from the Eastern Seaboard and the Ivy League down to the South, that they would be pulling the strings of who the candidates would be, what laws we would accept, and so forth. So since I said the War Council met 2 weeks ago in Texas, these are the events of history, and each one of them is a show of 2 or 3, 4 hours in itself.
Okay, now, so in the last 2 weeks you've had Hoover dying, the second man in the FBI resigning, Patrick Gray taking over the FBI as a so-called temporary director. You had LBJ going back in the hospital after a heart attack, George Wallace almost killed in Maryland, and John Connally resigning from a Republican administration.
Well, at the apex of his power. That's right, at the apex of his power. Realigning his forces. He's made it clear he's not resigning from political life. Right. He's going home to retrench.
So tie these together, and specifically let's get into what everybody's interested in, and that's Wallace.
That's Wallace. Well, that is the section where I mentioned since the War Council, Wallace was almost killed.
George Wallace has come up on the program before.
Yes.
I can't remember the day that Wallace was shot. Naturally, my thoughts at times went back to the past programs of Dialog Assassination, and I was trying to remember whether you had ever indicated that Wallace was a potential victim.
Well, the one man that I think is going to be a victim, and I've said this the last 3 years, is Richard Nixon. I think that Wallace can achieve something to assure Nixon's becoming the president now if Wallace doesn't run. And we'll go into the political complexities about this because...
But had you ever referred to Wallace, though?
I referred to multiple killings in 1972 to create chaos and anarchy, or the vision of violence, which is the cover story for canceling the elections in 1972 or taking complete control like Thieu was doing in Vietnam. The specific people that would be killed, I didn't say specifically Wallace, I say Richard Nixon, and I say Richard Nixon long before I had tape recordings or copies of the recordings of Louis Tackwood from the Los Angeles Police Department and how they're planning the killing of Richard Nixon. But in order to kill Richard Nixon, you have to create a lot of other people dying along the way so that violence or it's accepted then. You see, if Richard Nixon becomes president, and is killed and Agnew becomes president, people could riot in the streets and you'd have a lot of chaos and revolution. People would suddenly catch on. But if the climate is set now that Nixon could be killed, so what? We have violent nuts. Nobody's going to get aroused. Like in Greece, they didn't get aroused appropriately to the military coup because the climate was set for the situation that took place and people didn't think it through. So that there's going to be a lot of deaths, and there are a lot taking place. The second man on top of the NAACP in New York City was stabbed this week and killed. It had a 2-inch column, just said no motive. All the black leaders, right on down to the college-educated people, men like John Smith up at San Jose that I said was an important case, who worked at IBM, who had a scholarship. The smart ones are all being killed off, like the King Alfred plan. I'll bring that back and read it on a program on killing those people. But back to tying in the Wallace, the shooting for Wallace, I have... Again, this goes into Joe Justine, who has a newsletter in Germany. He wrote 6 books on the political assassinations. And his first book, Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy, was written right after the shootout in Dallas, long before the Warren Commission just wound up their work. But even at the meetings, talked about Joe Justine. And he has a newsletter that comes out from Germany every 2 weeks, and then he puts them into book form at the end of the year. And so his newsletter dated May the 15th, which just came out the same week we were doing our radio show. He was writing it there, and it says, "Hail to the CIA, at last they picked the right victim. The murder of J. Edgar Hoover by the CIA is an act of historic magnitude. It is a shadow cast well ahead of the forthcoming presidential election and in approved mafia style. Hoover, who knew too much, had to be eliminated in order to protect the lives and interests of the real leaders." Now, he has a whole thing that we won't do. Maybe we'll do another show because we want to go back to the Wallace. But again, the War Council met in Texas. 2 days later, we did a show on, and I implied that Hoover was killed, assassinated. There was no autopsy, and we did a show on why the CIA and the people in power in the White House would kill J. Edgar Hoover at this moment. So I'm going to show you how the news came in. Monday, Wallace was shot, Monday afternoon. And I've sat with the news articles since that time, up till the time of the program. And I'm going to read you how I do my research, because this system that I have took me several years to break down with the John Kennedy. That was a complicated assassination. But Once I got a way of cross-following it, I can use it for other murders to decide if they're political or not, if they're conspiracy or not. But if they are a conspiracy, and we're talking about assassination conspiracy, Phil, they follow certain patterns and they follow them straight down the line. If they're not conspiracy, if they're cold-blooded lone murderers, they have a different pattern. Now, I'm going to talk about the political effects, the motive for shooting Wallace, because the news throws out that this boy, Arthur Bremer, was a loner and that he was messy and he liked sex comics and all that. This is, again, what you call in espionage systems a cover story, because we're going to go to the facts. And in a political year, when a man is running for office, Wallace, who's important on the eve of a primary, it has to have some meaning that he was shot at that moment. If it doesn't, if all the evidence proves wrong, well and good. I'll have one less thing to follow, one less boy to read about. I have plenty of work as it is. But I broke down my study in these last 5 days on the political effects, the motive. What would be the motive if it were a conspiracy to kill Wallace? Then I did a chart of the similarities of this assassination attempt to the other assassinations, and I read off the similarities. I had 35 similarities in the first 4 days to the past political conspiracy. Then the next subject I study is the creation of the motive, the cover story. What stories are they using? Because there's two stories. One is the actual past of the man, and the other is the cover story. An example of that is the cover story that Lee Oswald had no job. He was a misfit, a loner. He got along with nobody. And we'll go into some of those cover stories. The truth is that he had a job at Jagger's Chili Stove for 6 months in Dallas, where you need a security clearance. It's a government printing office for overseas spy, for maps, domestic maps. Men who were our Presidio language school, Mr. Offstein, who learned Russian there, who was in the military, worked with Oswald, who discussed Russian language with him. Oswald had radio equipment. He had all the equipment of a spy and security clearances and so forth. The cover story is that he can't hold a job. The truth is he had a job at a sensitive place that is a government printing office. Okay, the fourth category I have is the headlines that say no conspiracy. Who is saying that? Remember, when I came in today, you showed me the early news things that you kept through the week. And was it 5 hours later that it was decided there was no conspiracy? Something like... It
was less than 5. I think it was about 3.
Okay,
3
he did
hours.
it alone, and no one else was involved. Okay,
Right.
So I break that down. You see, I take every news article every day now that comes out on this thing, and I change my typewriter roller 13 different times, and if I have more subjects, I'll put it in more, you see. But who is saying there's no conspiracy? What officials, what positions do they take? You know, like Ramsey Clark saying there was no conspiracy a few hours after Martin Luther King was killed, based on absolutely no evidence at all, out of the Justice Department. So he's used, the Attorney General. So then the fifth category I have is the federal government, who gets in the act. In this particular case, Richard Nixon, Patrick Gray III, Mr. Klein, that's the psychiatrist from the Justice Department giving the cover story. Who in the federal government gets into the scene? Then number 6 are the experts. Now, the experts are the CIA experts, not real experts. They're the writers, the psychiatrists who have covered other assassination stories, who get close to the alleged assassin and nobody else can see him. Now we come to what makes it a conspiracy. After the news hides the real political motives and tries to tie it in with all the other loners and tell you there's no conspiracy, what is the evidence? That is where you always prove. This is where the basis of my work is solid and the other research is that the weapons, the types of bullets, and the amount of bullets, and the direction of the shots. The next thing is the wounds of the victim. If you stick with the evidence and you stick with the wounds, you have to have a conspiracy. This is a repetition of the Ambassador Hotel because you have all these holes in Mr. Wallace, and then you have a Secret Service man shot in the throat, which is much higher than any wound in Wallace's body, and the gentleman wasn't crouched down shooting up, and you have 2 other people that had surgery that were taken to other hospitals. And the news, you have a bulletin here that came out right away. A woman was standing in the area, was hit. She was not behind him, and the man who shot him, you know, she wasn't directly behind, so that the bullet that went through his stomach hit her. See, there's no location of the people, the other 2 people, so that, like in the Ambassador Hotel, you have 10 bullets, and Sirhan's gun shoots 8. And in this case, you have a gun, which I'll read off, that the police authority says shoots 5 bullets. A gunman in the valley here that I know who's an expert on weapons said it could possibly be a 6-gun or a 5-gun. The police authority said it was a 5-bullet weapon. And all you have to do is add up the evidence. See, if you add up the physical evidence, Phil, then the cover stories, you separate those. Who's giving the cover stories and hiding the evidence? So then I cross-file I keep a list of the actual material that comes out on the weapons and the bullets and the amount of shots. And then I do another section on the wounds and the victims, where they're located and so forth. Then we get to what again is hardcore evidence. What was Bremer's actual past? What, besides the cover story that he fell in the ice like a baby, when he went skiing with somebody, a woman says he fell in the ice, and a 16-year-old girl says he couldn't do anything. All he did was make Nixon's Southern strategy possible. He affects the whole electoral process. But a 16-year-old girl is called to say he can't do anything. I mean, just look at what he's done to the political scene, and at the time of year he's done it. And then look at the people they call in. And then I have a column called the custody, the legal protection, and the charges. That's in the actual arraignment and so forth, because the only thing missing now is the named lawyers sent out from Muscle Shoals, Alabama. In every conspiracy case, they have named lawyers. And they're the only ones that get close to them. So if this was a conspiracy, he's not going to get some local lawyer that went to law school when his dad was running his business. And we haven't heard much about what business dad's in either. Then I have a section called Things That Make You Wonder, questions that are not answered in all of this, that if you put your head together, you begin to do your own thinking. And a section called Witnesses to Call. If there is a trial, I'll bet you these people won't be called and they won't be asked the questions that I would ask them. So I read my newspaper. This takes a lot of work to break every news article into these. Every news article doesn't cover these categories, but anything in this category I break into columns like mathematics. So that if you have a page, and I sit here and you've got just a page all full of numbers, it doesn't mean anything. But if you put them in columns, you get a different total.
So you have the Wallace incident
broken down,
as well as the Bobby and John Kennedy assassinations.
Well, you see what I did? I started with the John Kennedy assassination. Like, say you take right away the weapon, and they announce everything that has to do with the weapon. You put into weapon notebooks, because I have hundreds of notebooks on that. I've got 200 notebooks just breaking down that kind of stuff, because right away the weapon was a British rifle. Then it was a German Mauser for 24 hours. It was a German Mauser that the police had. This is on all the records and news media. Then 24 hours later, it became an Italian Carcano. And all the police officials in Dallas, and the Dallas police, the FBI, the Secret Service, nobody knew the difference between the Italian and the German. But as Mark Lane pointed out, if you turned it on its belly, written in English, it said made in Italy. So the weapon changed length, and it changed weight, and the scope, everything changed in 24 hours.
Do you know how the Wallace weapon is doing? Has it changed, metamorphized at all?
Well, a second weapon was found today, and we're going to go into that, but yesterday rather. Now, this is the category that I broke down the John Kennedy assassination. Now, what I did, we're talking about the Wallace right now, I broke the Kennedy into several hundred categories. This took me, I've done this 9 years. I completed the research that I wanted to write the books I'm doing on the John Kennedy thing, on Oswald the agent. And it's because of the way I did my research on Oswald the agent that I can understand Sirhan, James Ray, or Bramer, or any political patsy, Charlie Manson. The pattern is always the same. The cover stories come out fast. The people are assured there was no problem in the country. The physical evidence doesn't match any of the law of physics or ballistics or credibility in any shape or form. You see, when you get to the physical, then you have to go back, and this is what I did, and it took me so many years, is to say, well, if the bullet direction of the shots in John Kennedy don't match what they said happened, who were the people that gave the cover stories? Who do they work for? So you reconstruct cover stories. It didn't come easy. It took me a couple of years of reading the Warren Report and the Commission hearings. I think I sat with them just 2 years and read them till I saw a pattern evolving, a consistent pattern of the way they asked people questions before the Commission, what they didn't ask.
What kind of people What kind of people are responsible for putting out these cover stories?
Well, they're part of the power group that overthrew the government in 1963, and they maintain their power through cover stories. Now we're going to break down each one of these as time allows to show you how I come to the conclusion.
Yeah, but what kind of people are they that put out these cover stories?
Mr. Kissinger, Richard Nixon, the National Security Council, agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, Patrick Gray, the new head of the FBI. Those are the kind of people that give the orders of what happened.
Now, the statement that came up immediately after the shooting, and the legislation which has been proposed again, as it was proposed after the Robert Kennedy assassination and after the John Kennedy assassination, was let's ban the guns. By allowing these guns to be available, we are asking for these types of acts, and that America is sick.
Yeah.
And this has been well, if that were true, if you believe that, then you would have to not believe that there's any conspiracy. Well, you might believe. They don't necessarily go together, but a sick America, sick individuals in America with guns are...
Eliminates a conspiracy.
Yeah, they're easier to understand.
That's a cover story I brought in for you. I can't cross-file. Time doesn't allow me to cross-file every public official who says we have too much violence in this nation, this holier-than-thou kind of crap.
Well, that's a kind of an apple pie issue, too much violence.
But so what I brought in is a list for the first 2 days that the crime takes place. I bring in the public officials who give out this kind of no honest answer. That isn't, see, the real problem isn't these 20 or 30 or 40 people that were called on those first 2 days to talk about violence. The question is, how many bullets were shot in Maryland? How many bullets were recovered? And we'll go into the actual evidence. And then all the other cover story is ridiculous. The man who guarded Bobby Kennedy, the two men who were guarding him, have been written up as responsible for part of his death, and one was Bob Barry, who was formerly the FBI, and the other was Zane Caesar, who's been accused of shooting him from the back of the head, who was the guard. So to say we need gun laws is to hide the real conspiracies, and the more they say it, and the more they repeat it, it just clouds the actual evidence, which you're not getting on the air or on your news sheet. You get a little bit, and what you're not getting is important, because later you see the evidence that's coming through these yellow sheets that you're showing me of coming in on the news department, UPI. They're just throwing out pure garbage and repetition and not seeing the evidence of the case. And you say, well, where is the evidence? If Wallace lives or if Wallace dies, it doesn't become newsworthy. And then later, the various researchers like myself are looking for the evidence, the physical evidence, because we're on to the way the system works now. And that's what's not in the news. And when the researchers work and find those bullets in Los Angeles and how many there are and realize that Sirhan's gun was thrown away and the evidence was tampered with, the people's minds are so set that Sirhan was a nut or a kook or that society is violent that they don't even follow when we talk about the evidence. You know, it's happened.
Okay,
now,
we'll get into the Wallace shooting in more detail after we break for station identification. You're listening to Dialog Conspiracy, and this is KLRB FM Carmel, stereo 24 hours a day.
Philly, we're talking now about the political effects. We'll go down the line of the different categories I was referring to. This is a political year, and the reason that Tagwood talked about the LAPD killing radicals in San Diego, it was so that Nixon could round up his opposition, people that didn't like his policy, be excused to lock them all up. And they planned to kill certain congressmen and newsmen that would be down there as an excuse for law and order. Now, Hitler needed law and order to come into power. And the political effect of shooting Wallace is, number one, it brings a law and order ticket. People get scared of the violence all around us. We're told it's everywhere. And the next important thing is that all the news people everywhere, I've talked all week, and you've heard it, Phil, on how the death of Wallace would affect Humphrey or McGovern. But it's very interesting that nobody talks about how it would affect Richard Nixon. Because, again, in the political assassination of John Kennedy, the question came up of Sue Bono, who gains by killing John Kennedy? And the important point is that Nixon is the only man, Humphrey and McGovern, don't gain by the killing of Wallace. It would be Nixon, because I mentioned briefly a few minutes ago that Wallace came out against busing. So Nixon has to come out against busing, even though as the President of the United States, these laws had gone through. Nixon has what he calls a Southern strategy, and that's to pull in the whole South, the hate votes, the Vietnam, the war contracts, the aerospace industries through Florida, Georgia, Alabama, California. The warfare state its financial headquarters are in the South, Texas, Houston, and the aerospace industries, the bulk of it, Ohio and the southern states. This is the bulk of the aerospace and the racist votes. And Nixon needs those. And Mr. Wallace was taking them away from him. Even in the North, the night of that shooting, he was taking out 40% of the Republican votes. In a 70% Republican area, Wallace got 30% of the votes that night. If Wallace is killed, Nixon gets 70%. He gets all of that because they're not going to give it to McGovern. And if Wallace is dead, Richard Nixon benefits. His vote isn't split. And it's conspicuous how the news people don't analyze that Richard Nixon gains, just like Richard Nixon gains from the death of his old friend J. Edgar Hoover. The White House counsel, the group that sit around him, advised him, get rid of Hoover, he's bad, the name is being smeared, the FBI, the reputation is going down, some of his tactics, and all of his advisors outvoted Nixon, who stayed loyal to his friend. But Hoover was an embarrassment, and besides that, it was time to tighten control on all of these things, on all of the political assassinations and the control of the United States. So Richard Nixon is a direct beneficiary of the Wallace, if Wallace dies.
Okay, if you accept that premise, then what significance do you attach to the fact that Nixon sent one of his personal physicians to aid Wallace's doctors, and that he offered the presidential suite at Walter Reed Hospital to Wallace?
Well,
that the FBI is guarding Wallace, guarding Bremer.
Yeah, well, that's like saying, what do you think of the position that the federal government was so nice that they let the autopsy of John Kennedy be at Bethesda, Maryland Hospital instead of Dallas, Texas? The Dallas officials wanted the autopsy there, and it would have read differently if they had the body there. You see, taking control, the federal government taking care of the Wallace party is wiping up the evidence and scooping it all up. To indicate that, in my list of similarities, and this is very interesting, Wednesday I was typing similarities, those 35 that I hope we'll have time to go into, some of them. But when Bremer was in jail, he had head injuries, you see, and he asked for a doctor. And President Nixon, this is President Nixon, gave permission from the White House that he could have a physician, and it was specified if that physician be accompanied by an FBI agent. Now, this is very generous of him, that the man only has some stitches on his head, but an FBI has to get in the room. So under similarities, I made a note, and this is the way it reads. When Sirhan was in jail, he was never alone with a psychiatrist. He had to have Robert Kaiser, who we did many shows on. He's CIA, he's government employee, who wrote the official history of what happened at the Ambassador Hotel. RFK must die. It's a bad book. It's slanted. It leaves out the physical evidence of the murder. The contact Sirhan did, it goes into the thing of mind control, like go into violence, to cover story. Robert Kaiser worked for Life and Henry Luce, and then for his background is with Tom Braden and the CIA. Kaiser was sent to the cell of Sirhan the night that Robert Kennedy was shot. And he was with him all the time, even in personal relationships with the psychiatrist. He was the court reporter, so to speak, and we've gone into babysitters of Jack Ruby, having Joe Tannehill and Belli. Well, this is the same thing. The sending of the White House aides is more spooky, Phil, than if they just leave Wallace alone. His doctor wants him in Alabama for the neck surgery. The White House wants him at Walter Reed. You see, Walter Reed can keep...
His doctors want him in
Alabama. Yes, that was in the news Friday. The doctors want him in Alabama, but Washington came into this thing in an almost paranoid stage, and maybe we'll have to do a show in 2 stages on this because there's so much evidence, and I think it's pertinent.
I didn't know there was that conflict between Wallace's doctors and the White House as to the location of the next surgery.
Yeah, if you look at my table of contents here, Section 5 is how the federal government gets into the act. They're into it plenty. You see,
that's pretty obvious from looking at the federal assistance that has been offered since the shooting.
Don't forget that your Monterey Herald this week had an article on the personality of Bremer, Oswald and Sirhan.
I think it's Bremer.
Bremer, I'm sorry. But it said that Oswald and Sirhan were compared to this new alleged assassin Bremer, and the word came out by a psychiatrist often called by the Justice Department. Now you see, I cross-filed those little words. See, to the average person that doesn't mean much. But when you know how the Justice Department lied, just plain lied.
Yeah, this is an AP story, and I noted that article also.
Yeah.
It also pointed out in the article that this Justice Department, or this person often called by the Justice Department, had never interviewed Oswald or Sirhan personally, or Bremer, and he was doing this all from almost by remote control. Actually, he was
you see, he
analyzing these people.
That's right. Now he has taken these adjectives that loner, alienated, acted on impulse. I wrote down the adjective: low level of frustration. They're threatened. They try to change the world. They're separated from their families. They're alienated. They have revenge. The world is full of chaos. They want to clean it up. They want to change the world. Now, every one of those adjectives that he gives, I spent 8 years, Phil, going into those words on Lee Harvey Oswald and who said those words to describe Oswald, because the evidence was so different. See, Oswald was not alienated. We talked about how when he arrived in New York City from the Soviet Union, he was met with a limousine. His transportation was paid by the State Department. All legal waivers were passed to let his Russian wife come in. Oswald was treated like a very important person, which he was. And I have the name of the man who met him at the harbor, who's linked with heavy political alliances in this state. Oswald was not alienated, but the Justice Department puts these adjectives out. And I've spent 8 years on Oswald and then the other assassins who originated the original words on Oswald and now is using as a pattern for all these other scenes.
We were talking about Dr. David Abramson.
Yes,
right?
The New York psychiatrist. Now, Abramson has never met any of the other boys, nor has he spent 8 years finding who said that Oswald acted on impulse. He even contradicts himself here, because the news articles this week say that Mr. Bremer went from place to place and stalked him and went to different campaign places in Michigan and Kalamazoo and Maryland and Milwaukee. Well, if he was stalking him, he wasn't acting on impulse. He was down to his last $2 and had 2 weapons and a radio band. That isn't impulse. See, the psychiatrist, it's a great thing to be able to be on the air here at KLRB, Phil, and talk out some of these things if we can't cover all of them. I think that the response this week to people wanting to hear about Wallace was so good. And if we just talk to people without any lies, you out there can hear the inconsistencies of one article saying he acts on impulse and the other saying he stalked him.
It might be interesting, if people are interested, to question the Associated Press and ask whether that particular psychiatrist volunteered the information to AP, or whether AP sought him out.
Or if he went to a medical school paid by the Army. Several psychiatrists that gave information on the political assassination were medical men in the Army who got their further degrees in the Army. And they were paid. Their education was paid by the Army. I'm not saying this is true of Dr. Abramson, but he has to have some reason. He wrote a book called Our Violent Society, and he has not gone into the actual evidence. You see, in the James Ray case, Mr. Frank, Gerald Frank, says that in that new book that James Ray stalked and followed Martin Luther King with a determination to get him that took 1.5 years. Well, that isn't acting on impulse. If these are the people you're talking about, the evidence, they throw out one thing and they throw the other, and nothing they say is true. So just briefly again, the political advantage that you haven't read in the newspapers, that Richard Nixon, if Wallace is dead, gets all the Southern votes. They'll go to Richard Nixon, who followed Wallace's busing decision, and all the latent racist hatred that Wallace could pull in, Nixon will inherit if Wallace doesn't run. Now, there was another reason getting Wallace out of the way. Wallace doesn't like Nixon or the establishment either. And he not only didn't like the busing or the integration of the South, but he didn't like Richard Nixon any better. And he was winning votes on that, because there's a lot of people in this country that don't like Richard Nixon. And Wallace didn't like Vietnam. And the important thing is that he does not like the establishment. And he's not their kind of cookie. He wasn't at that ranch at that party when he was alive. He wasn't called down there with John Connally and the gang. You see, they're a one-party group, Democrat, Republican are melding. And Wallace is a big figure in this country. He doesn't go to those kind of parties, see? He is something apart and different. And Nixon, and don't ever forget as you read the news, that Nixon gains if Wallace dies. Simple vote counting, Nixon gains, and no one has had the nerve to write that up.
Now, you've made these comparisons between the JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King assassinations.
I marked them off. That's right. The comparisons to the cover stories and the way it was handled, I briefly typed them off as I went through my news articles, and then I'll go into greater comparisons later. The first headline was he was a loner. This happened in all the assassination cover stories, and I have several hundred books of news clippings on the John Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the Sharon Tate, La Bianca massacre, the Oda case in California. What I consider political assassinations, these news articles, I take 8 papers a day. They're Scotch tape dated, put in chronological order. The similarities that run through are like this, that this Bremer was a loner. Then they referred to the smirk on his face. This was all the assassins. Robert Kaiser was called in Thursday, and he said the first thing I noticed was the smirk on his face. They all asked for the Civil Liberties Union. This, again, was a cover. These are agents of the intelligence government, but they covered by asking for the Civil Liberties Union. They break down his personality. In this case, they brought in...
Bremer has asked for that?
Yes, he asked...
ACLU?
Yes. He asked for the ACLU, too. The creation of the motives. In this case, it was movies and comics. They brought in a new thing. The other guys didn't read dirty movies or comics. The others were political in the sense that communist literature was found around their rooms, Sirhan and Oswald, and they were not communists. There were more bullets than the gun allows in all of these murders, in the Sirhan and the Martin Luther King and the Robert Kennedy. The gun only shoots so many, and there were several more bullets in Martin Luther King's body that didn't come from the Lorraine Motel. We'll go into that evidence many times. No other suspects were ever expected. This ran through all of them. The getaway car. There was another getaway car, and they followed it. They had the description of the man, his weight and height. They stopped on a freeway, and they let him go. They had suspects in every one of these murders. They let them go. The story about they don't get along with their mothers. They said James Ray was an orphan. His parent is alive. Oswald didn't get along with his mother. This boy, he shut the door on her face. It's like Camus' story, The Stranger. Wallace was at the peak of his political career, and even for primary, like Robert Kennedy. John Kennedy was beginning to get things into effect. He'd been in office. He was getting ready for the election in '64, and this was at the peak of 2 primaries. The CBS was on the spot, and they filmed a man. And they have a picture. This is, again, your cover story, and they had a whole page in the Chronicle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They had him lined up the shots like, here he is, here's the man aiming, here he's shooting, here's Wallace falling, here's Wallace's wife holding him, like Jackie Kennedy, and here's Wallace on the ground. Now, CBS took a picture of that, and they say, this is how it happened. They took a picture of Altamont at the time of the Rolling Stones concert. The camera aimed at Jack Ruby shooting Oswald. There were pictures of the ambassador, of Sirhan, and Robert Kennedy. That does not prove there was no conspiracy. In every one of these cases, there was a conspiracy, and there were more gunmen. The fact that the camera takes a picture and like a primer, like see Jane run, see Ted go, they give you a primer in your newspaper, 1 to 6. This is how it happened, one man. The newsreel, if you saw it the first day in the crowd, there was a man next to this Bremer who was smiling over at him and kind of laughing and nodding to him just before when his face was in the crowd. They were looking at each other. But they give you this is the way it happened, A, B, C, D. Now, another man gets on, a Democrat from Congress, a Democratic candidate, and he says, I think this will help. Oh, he was the one man, I did make note, who will help Richard Nixon and Humphrey. This shooting will hurt McGovern, and it'll help Humphrey. His name is William Hugel, a candidate for Congress. This was the one man who noted what I was saying. A state Republican chairman named Putnam Livermore came out with the identical words that were used as a cover story, and I repeat them. This was caused by another mindless malcontent. A Mr. Livermore, the identical name, was placed on an important committee, Republican committee this week with Shirley Temple Black. I'd never heard the name before. But Mr. Livermore came out. I don't know if it's the same Livermore, but it's an unusual name. He was appointed to a high position by Nixon this week and called it a Mindless malcontent is another cover word they use. Another similarity is that before 24 hours were over, only one person was involved. This was true in all the crimes. The Secret Service came out the very next day and said the possibility of a conspiracy has been ruled out. This is identical to the Oblonsky killing. The political labor leaders, the musicians, they haven't even talked about much as a conspiracy. We'll stick to the major political murders. The possibility has been ruled out. How can it be ruled out? He may have shot for money. He may have been hired to kill because he stood there and shot. If you think it out clearly, and I want to say this very clearly, if they say the possibility of conspiracy is ruled out, just because one man stood there and shot the biggest competition that Richard Nixon had in this country at the present time doesn't mean that he wasn't paid to do it. You see, his past, the secret of his past, is something that you're not allowed to know yet. Now, the Maryland State Police Superintendent, Thomas Smith, said it was a .38 5-shot revolver. There are .38 6-shots, but the state police superintendent said it was a 5-shot revolver. Now, I don't know why he would say that. And again, all the other suspects were let go. A man 6 feet 2 inches, 225 pounds, driving a blue Cadillac, was wanted as a suspect, and he was on the Baltimore Beltway. They let him go. They don't tell you why they were looking for him or what this description was.
Now the story that came out that afternoon was that they had been mistaken, that this car had been wanted on a license plate switching offense, and that the bulletin they issued was a coincidence, and that they hadn't meant to tie it in with the Wallace shooting. That they had been looking for this car on this license plate switching.
This is one of the coincidences.
Right, and somebody, they said, picked it up and took it to mean that they were looking for this car in connection with the Wallace shooting, which they later denied.
Well, that's like the band on the police station, radio station, with the exact description of Lee Harvey Oswald before they had any indication of what he would look like. You know, these are all coincidences, too. They couldn't trace who gave the description, but they had the description. And they also did say earlier that they had some other suspects, and then they let them go. Now, another similarity to all the political assassinations, which we touched on, is trying to blame hate and violence. This runs through the whole thing. That's the cover story. And blind violence. They try to say it's blind. It's violence in American society, which is one thing. And then they call it the blind violence. Now, this particular boy, when he was arrested, wanted to talk to his lawyer. He wouldn't speak up. He knew his legal rights, and he's perfectly aware of all of the intricacies involved. And so was Oswald Sirhan, James Ray. They know exactly what to do in the event that they're caught. The creation of the motive goes into about 15 descriptions, and all of them are wrong. This runs through the whole thing. The mention of the gun purchase. Now, this is important in breaking down the similarities. In every one of these political assassinations, there's a lot of talk about a gun purchase. And in all of the articles, there's no indication of where the bullets are found or how the bullets are recovered or if the bullets match the weapon that was purchased. Every boy has a gun located right away, like the gun that James Ray had, you know, where it was bought in Birmingham, or the gun that Oswald had from Klein's in Chicago, and Sirhan's gun. They traced the gun, but the bullet found in the victim does not match the gun in most of these cases, and the amount of bullets in the victims or in the vicinity of the people standing the ambassador in this place in Maryland cannot equal the gun's capability. And that's where the conspiracy comes in. When you stick to the evidence of the case, and I want to make this perfectly clear, when you stick to the amount of bullets shot and the capability of the weapon, and this is the part that people don't read because it doesn't get the play up in the news. There's nothing in the news since Monday about where the bullets were recovered. You see, one man...
Or how many were recovered.
That's right. Now, we have a diagram of the body under the wounds. I have a diagram that was published from the doctor, like we had a diagram of John Kennedy's body. And the bullets don't match where Oswald was standing, the bullet direction. There was a picture in the Chronicle of the wounds. One over in his chest and lung, and the one in the spinal cord. And one on the right arm above, by the shoulder, in the middle of the arm, and then down below. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bullets in Governor Wallace's body, but they're all lower than the chest cavity. They're right to the chest cavity.
5 bullets in his body or 5 bullets wounds?
5 wounds. But the Secret Service man that had surgery at the hospital, Walter Reed Hospital, had 6-hour surgery in a throat. Now that's higher than any wound in the governor. And the 2 people that were also shot, there has been no description of the location of where their wounds were. They had to be directly behind him, and the bullets had to go through him to them in some way. One of the men was wounded in the leg, which is lower than the Wallace body chart. You follow? And one was in the throat. So one is higher than Wallace, and one is lower than where Wallace was shot.
What's possible, ricochet or something?
Well, it would be interesting if instead of talking about violence and instead of talking about loners or alienation, it would be interesting if they would stick to the bullets or the location of the bullets. I think that it's important to stick with the evidence of the case and not the cover story. And the less you read in the news on the actual evidence, and the more you read the cover story, like gun laws and violence, the more you have to look for the information on the evidence, because that's where the real truth is. If it was a political assassination, and you also, besides that, have to look in the background of this particular person. You see, today, Friday's paper had an article on, it saw Wallace suspect at the end of his rope, and it was on page 24. It wasn't in the front pages. And I'm just going into this to show you how to study whether it was a conspiracy or just plain nut shooting. The title's called Wallace Suspect at the End of the Rope, and you think that you're going to find that he's really having a nervous breakdown, that he's a lone misfit, and he's going to crack up. It doesn't make page 1, and it tells you that he only had $2, and he was tired and hungry and had slept in his car following this man around for 2 weeks. But at the end it said, on the floor behind the front seat, covered with a hand towel, the agents found a Westinghouse tape recorder, a portable radio equipped with special band to pick up police broadcasts, a pair of powerful binoculars, and 3 clips for an automatic pistol. That was in his car. Now, that doesn't make the headlines. You see, this is physical evidence. In Oswald's garage were all the pieces of equipment of an agent of some sort. Electronic devices, pedometers, telescopes, knives, radio band. Again, he had photographs, several kinds of cameras. There was all kinds of equipment, electronic equipment, in his garage that was described and inventoried in the Warren Commission hearings and exhibits. But the witness testimony doesn't talk about where he learned to use this stuff or where he purchased it or what he'd be using it for. See, that's the witnesses that are called never talk about who sold him this tape recorder, who has fingerprints. If there's another gun that they found in the back of his car, does it have fingerprints on it? You see, that is where the evidence comes in. And when this stuff comes through the news, this came from the New York Times service. This doesn't come from the Associated Press or the United Press. And you learn to read the news when evidence comes in that's important to solving the mystery of the case. It doesn't come over the Associated Press or United Press all the time. See, it's a complicated procedure to pass off a conspiracy as being a loner. You have your cover story. You have your public officials assuring you immediately that before they could possibly go into whether he was put up to this, you know, there's no way of their knowing. But they want you to know that nothing is wrong in the land. So that by Friday, after the shooting of Wallace, you find out that there was another weapon involved. That it was a brown 9mm automatic pistol equipped with a wooden stock and a clip of ammunition that was in the car. There was another weapon involved in that car. There was a radio. There were radio bands confused in the getaway car of at the time of the Martin Luther King killing, you know, coming in along with the radio stations. This boy had the radio, tape recorders, binoculars, another weapon, and ammunition.
Now, the fact that this equipment was found in his car. What does that tell you?
Well, what it tells me is that it took 6 days to admit the equipment was there. It got the 24th page of the newspaper, and the title article is to make you think the boy's cracking because he's mentally sick. I think the boy knows how to use this equipment, and I think he could be a trained, hired person to kill Wallace at the time of an election year. That's what it tells me, that the hard evidence that will come in won't make the headlines, and it won't make Associated Press, and it won't make United Press. But the equipment of a boy smarter than you think, they're not telling you about. Now, when they do a cover story again, they say the man, Bremer, Arthur Bremer, who was arraigned, was a busboy and a waiter. They don't tell you the club that he worked at in Milwaukee or who he saw there. The man who was in charge of the entertainment at this club, which was a racist or a segregated private social club where he was a waiter, tells you that this young Bremer was a paranoid. The psychiatrist says he's just dull normal, but the man in contact with him at an exclusive club at Milwaukee is giving the story that he's paranoid. Again, he's not a psychiatrist. I'm jumping around on the truth of what a person is and the way the media makes it out. Like the media says he's at the end of his rope. They're actually talking about evidence in the last paragraph hidden in the news. So if you don't take the paper and you don't take the New York Times, you're going to miss this. Again, they sent in Robert Kaiser, who will say, I want to compare him to all the other assassins, and maybe Kaiser will write the official story of how Wallace was killed, and everything will be hidden instead of told because no other writer or researcher will get to him. Now, in the room of Bremer, when they went into his rooming house, they found a Black Panther paper. No blacks were involved in this murder. Panthers weren't involved. When the Sharon Tate massacre happened, they took the blood of these people and wrote on the door, death to the pigs. Later, it was admitted that they wanted people to think it was a race war, that blacks were involved. They threw in this little Panther paper to confuse you and to confuse what was happening. In summary, now, we just have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and again, there's no time to go in all the similarities. We may, if there's enough interest, we'll do a continuation next week on this particular case. But in the interim of this week, save your newspapers. You people who are listening, if you take 1 paper or 2 or 3, save your papers on the Wallace story. And whenever somebody from the Justice or the federal government comes into the thing, make a note of it, what role they have and what they're saying, and just save it a while, like I did the John Kennedy things. And remember that as of this day, as of this Saturday, there has not been any mention yet into what position these people were standing that received bullet wounds in addition to Wallace. You see, that is important. And they don't mention what kind of ammunition was used. The bullets that we recovered, they've never mentioned what kind of ammunition was used. There's still a bullet in Wallace's body. They never mention where the ammunition was bought, or what kind of bullets, or how many bullets. The news media talks about the loner, the misfit, the paranoid. They don't talk about how many bullets are received. Now, maybe the hospital in Washington wants that body, so when they remove the bullet from the spine, they'll pull something like they did at Parkland Hospital with bullet 399, the famous bullet that we've talked about on other shows. Watch the evidence in the next week. You have all the rumors this week of the loner and chaos and changing society. It's interesting that Oswald, in a press conference, said, I'm a patsy, I didn't kill anybody, I didn't have a rifle. And then he was killed 2 days later. And Sirhan's mother has said, Sirhan's isolated, she said if the truth was told about that murder, it would shake the entire nation when the truth is really told. And James Ray, who says there's a conspiracy, is isolated from the press, from people, researchers. We can never get to the political conspirators, the patsies, or the people involved in the murders, and the isolation of Bremer will be just as tight. These are some of the reasons why I think it was a conspiracy, Phil. Does that make sense?
Makes you wonder.
Well,
once again.
These are some of the reasons why I think you should look for a conspiracy of Richard Nixon and the FBI and the CIA to kill Wallace, so he will not compete and take those votes from Nixon that Nixon needs in the South to remain president of the United States.
I'm sure people will be looking at the news in the next 7 days in an entirely different light.
I hope so.
That's Mae Brussell, a political research specialist for KLRB. I'm Phil Kogan.
been listening to Dialog. Dialog is a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.